Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry back with part 3 of our asynchronous dialogue. We're looking at student questions for column 2113, week 1 readings, our media culture and social influence digital lecture series. And I want to jump to a question from Michelle, who's responding to Berger's Media and Society, a critical introduction. And looking at this, Michelle writes, Berger says on page 5, quote, "This matter of our behavior being predictable is quite interesting and extends to realms other than choosing films to see or television programs to watch," end quote. And thus comes the question, how does this predictability in behavior make communication easier? How does it make it more difficult, and so on? And so we could definitely think about communication of all kinds as a kind of moving target, right? And so, let's think about the idea of technology always evolving. And we have newer ways to communicate, and with each new layer of communication, they bring their own kinds of codes and conventions, and we adapt to those, sometimes slowly. And by the time we feel like we've learned or mastered them, the needle moves further, right? I think about something even like texting, text messages, and how information changes on us, right? You have the sort of the signs and symbols of how are we supposed to appropriately text, right? Versus in what ways do we easily miscommunicate when we're texting? You think about something like all caps, or not understanding when someone is using sarcasm, that sort of thing. But then we have this whole new layer of something like emojis. And of course, emojis are this new thing, but they also represent something older, right? This idea of visual signs and symbols. We were doing this thousands of years ago, right? I mean, hieroglyphic language systems were built on sort of pictorial symbols, but here we are having resurrected these qualities for our commercial digital uses. But so we have these emojis, and they give us a set, all right? And so you'll have like your early adapters, and then you have your latecomers, and then you have folks that refuse to adapt. And even amongst those that refuse to adapt, eventually we kind of start to apply these new principles. But just as soon as, by the time everyone is practicing them, two things happen. First, the people at the front end have already adapted how they use them. Meaning, let's think about how signs change, right? Or rather, signs don't change, but the meanings behind the signs change. Think, for example, about how certain emojis carry certain connotative, right, cultural meanings, secondary meanings, and that's a nice callback to our previous discussion about denotative versus connotative language and word usage. Emojis have those same qualities, right? They have their base function, like what do they clearly represent on the surface level, but then there's that is their overt meaning. But when we have these secondary or cultural assigned new usages for something even rudimentary like an emoji, you have reappropriated uses, right? They take on kind of new language uses that carry different meanings. And it may be intended that the receiver of that message understands the new meanings, or this is where we get that distinction of like an inside joke where someone can receive those and it's entirely intended to go over the receiver's head, meaning I'm kind of sending a message. I'm intentionally not knowing you are not going to receive it the right way. So we can kind of think of that as a way that that is just a form of texting. That is a form of a newer brand of communication. And it is communication by all means. Anything we're doing digitally, particularly with smartphones or emailing, whatever, this all falls under the blanket category of CMC, or computer mediated communication. And by the way, In the Comm Major, we even offer such an introductory course. We have an intro to computer-mediated communication, intro to CMC. And so we recognize that kind of communication continuously evolves. And so we have to be able to equip ourselves for these new language systems, new uses constantly. We're just like the software, the hard drives, the whatevers. We need our updates as well to maintain relevancy, right? To maintain information literacy, and not just for fun, right? Not just so we can kind of communicate with young people or understand what our kids are saying or something like that. We need those upgrades to remain kind of relevant, active parts and participants in society and part of culture. And sometimes it's about so that we are ahead. It's not about being ahead or anything like that, but even when we're not needing to fill the tug of society or progress or whatever, we still want to have agency, right? We want to have our own self-worth, and part of that can come through the fulfillment of understanding how the complex systems of communication that simply coincides along progresses in technology, mass media, information, and what have you. What a great question. Communication is a moving target. Let me jump to a question from Kristen. All right, and this is looking at Berger's Messages, Chapter 1. Since our communication reflects the world within and around us, could this be a reason why some people feel stuck? If the communication we have with others on a daily basis is always the same, does this contribute to becoming complacent in life? Could broadening who we communicate with potentially change the direction of our lives, both good and bad? There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. I can't possibly unpack it all, as a matter of fact, and certainly in an ideal world we could have this conversation for a considerable amount of time. But on the short end of things, yes, we can broaden who we communicate, and that can potentially change the trajectory of who we are. No, not just both for good and bad, both. And I love the way you finish the end of this, because too often I see students asking questions that frame the response as an either or, that there has to be some kind of yes, no, agree, disagree subject line there in a response, when in fact so much of how we should think or rethink about the world is through that understanding of it's not an either or situation we find ourselves engaging, but there's a both and potential, that there is room for us to disagree with ourselves. And I'm not trying to get us too deep into the philosophical or epistemological weeds, but that is true, and it's true of communication, and especially with the complexities of these things. So we can think about something like you go on to get an advanced degree, right? And so the further you go in a degree path in a single type of direction, the more specialized you become, right? This is how someone shifts from becoming a student to a medical student to a physician, right? Like they're going through this passageway that's getting more narrow and specific, but they're gaining more information, they're gaining more experience, they're gaining more know-how, they're learning from others, they're understanding, they're learning, they're studying case studies, they're performing practical work, they're gaining specialization, they're becoming that new thing. And there is the better and the worse, right? They're going to deal with think about like working as an attorney or something, you're not going to win every case, right? There are going to be wins and losses, quote unquote, like judgments that go your way, judgments that go against your clients, physicians. You will have, depending on the kind of physician, let's say surgeon, right? You will assist many lives. You will likely have a nice kind of like a stability of income. A great opportunities before you, but there may be times where everything you put into something isn't enough, right? Or these rarer instances, but on the whole of like malpractice, okay, or the kind of downsides, right? The both and approach is a good one. Second question here from Berger's introduction to messages. Our textbook assumes that we are always sending and receiving messages, sending and receiving keywords, which we try to control the ones we are sending and interpret the ones we are receiving. I agree. We all do this. And yes, this is it. However, each of us interpret certain words and body language differently. Also true. Is this a case? But we do have shared qualities. There is shared interpretation, but this is true. Is this a case of poor communication on the sender's part or on the receiver's part? There's an either or that may not necessarily be a case. It can be both. Someone can be both a poor sender of information and they're sending it to someone that's a poor receiver. Or you think about like people that are just mismatched. Like, think about like couples that can't get along. And so many of these problems can sometimes be at just base levels of communication. One is a poor sender, one's a poor receiver, or one prefers to send in a certain way, the other is diametrically opposed to that method of reception, and they'd rather receive messages in an alternative form. And so there's constant miscommunication, and constant miscommunication leads to continuous tension, a lack of resolve, and can open or upend the relationship itself. Is there a right or wrong way to communicate effectively if an individual is expressing one's own feelings, perception, opinion? And I don't want to pretend to be social psychologist in this instance. I know some of you all are on that road to being well trained in that arena. Is there really a way to control? Here's a question I'll entertain. Is there really a way to control the messages we are sending to others? And I think this takes me to a key word for us, right? Objectivity. There's subjectivity, right? I'm being very subjective. I'm being very kind of like narrow focused or me focused, or kind of narrow casting my message. But then objectivity is about maybe like removing or distancing our emotional response to something. This gets at a different question someone else has later relating to Aristotelian message strategies, pathos, ethos, logos. But getting back on track here, is there really a way to control the messages we are sending to others? Objectivity here, my response would be, it's just one of several responses I could come up with. But the thing that I gravitate to is that objectivity helps us control our communication, because we're trying to be objective and thus remove our emotional response to something. Hey, rhetorical question, obviously. You ever have someone say or ask or communicate with you in a way that's intentionally trying to get at maybe an emotional sensitivity that you have, right? They're trying to stir something with you, stir a response in a certain way. And how do we circumvent that? Objectivity, practicing that's a personal discipline, right? That's an individual choice. Like, I'm choosing to be objective in this situation, in this circumstance, instead of creating, emotion has a place, and it is important, and it makes us human. And then there are instances where it doesn't help remedy a situation or remedy a communication. It can exacerbate it, right? And so objectivity helps us control our communication. And here's another practical: learning to control our body language helps us helps us to contain overt responses, right? And so you think about, is there a way to control the messages we are sending to others? So we're recognizing that we have our verbal responses to people, but we also have our nonverbal responses, of which body language is a nonverbal response, right? Everything we're doing that's not the spoken word itself is nonverbal communication. So that even includes the tone of voice I'm using, right? The volume, the level in which I'm communicating at you. This is all nonverbal communication. And so if I can master a sense of self-control in that arena with those, if I can limit or minimize, right, my responses or the ways in which I respond, that is a way in which I can practice I can minimize and practice discipline, and it can aid and assist that sense of objective response to communication. And maybe, just maybe, it can help me to be a problem solver in the world, and a stronger communicator as a result. Let's pause there, and we'll continue this dialogue in week 1 with part 4. Thank you for listening.